So section 4.1 is what we're going to focus on now. We actually did the sections in your textbook out of order because I thought it would be a better idea to tell you about natural selection first and then to talk about the things that go along with it rather than the other way around. So section 4.1 is really still about natural selection. So we're continuing on from yesterday's class where we talked about what were the points in Darwin's theory. And we're just giving a little bit more explanation as to why some of these things happen, maybe a little bit more vocabulary that we could use to discuss it. So we're going to look at the questions that are on page 121 of your textbook. And in looking at them and answering them, we will make up the notes that we'll take for this section. So we're going to start with question number 1. Question number 1 says, identify 5 adaptations of this grizzly bear, and there's a picture of the grizzly bear, that make it well suited for survival in its habitat. All right, maybe we'll continue our discussion of weird foods that we have eaten another day, and we'll start answering some of these questions. So question number 1 was, what are the adaptations of a grizzly bear? And don't worry, I will give you time to write this other stuff down. I would like to just know first, what were some of your ideas for the adaptations? So the idea of a long nose or their snout shape so that they can fish and catch food, that would be a great one. Who else has got one? I heard lots of them. What did I hear you guys say? It's brown, that's kind of tree colored. Yeah. So it's brown and it's got thick hair, which both provide it with camouflage and protection against the cold temperature of where it likely lives, around here somewhere. What else do we have? I heard someone else say something good over here. You guys had one. Yep, the claws. So what do grizzly bears use their claws for? Picking things up, for sure. They can climb with them. They can poke things with them. I know my daughter, after we watched Brave the first time, and she watched the mother try to like pick up the berries with her fingernails, because she's really a queen, but she's turned into a bear. She has these little fake stick-on fingernails, and she was stabbing everything in sight with them. So the claws are very useful. Anybody else have something that they want to add to the list? I heard someone say something about their legs back there. Yeah, so the idea of them being muscular, bears are very strong. They have a lot of muscle, and the muscle allows them to run very quickly, to climb things, to catch things. Did anyone put something on there that maybe isn't about how they look, but how they act? Yeah? Okay, so we could talk about their aggression or their nature to fight back if they need to defend themselves, the idea of a mother protecting her cubs, anything that has to do with this sort of combative behavior that would happen when they feel like they're in danger. That's behavioral, but it's definitely an adaptation. If a mother bear was not fierce and aggressive when her cubs were in danger, would they always be protected? Probably not. Did anyone say anything maybe about this? Nice. Bears hibernate, a lot of them, and hibernation, even though it's not a physical characteristic, is an adaptation that the bear has that helps it survive. If a bear did not hibernate, then there would be periods of the winter where it would be almost impossible for them to acquire food. Now, do all bears do this all the time? No. But there are bears who hibernate, and that is an adaptation. You know, that's a good question. Like where... No, like where did it come from? And I don't have the absolute answer like specifically to hibernation, but in general, if it's a behavior, a lot of animals are born with sort of imprinted instinctual behaviors, like the idea of a duck following its mother. Now, hibernation is a little bit more advanced of a behavior, so it's very probably a learned behavior that's going on, but it's still an adaptation. Now, where did the first bear decide that this was a good idea? Couldn't tell you. I have to do some research to figure that out. But I know that I've often thought, man, isn't hibernation a good idea? Wouldn't it be nice if you could just be like, it's November, I'm going to sleep, and I'll see you guys in March. Have a nice winter, etc. I think that would be wonderful. So these are some examples of adaptations. Now, what is an adaptation? By definition, an adaptation is a characteristic that makes an organism better suited to live and reproduce. And I really want to highlight the word reproduce. For the theory of natural selection to be supported, we always have to be talking about, did that organism pass its characteristics on? Was it able to reproduce? And so an adaptation means that the organism can survive, but also has the chance to reproduce. Now, the adaptation doesn't have to give them better reproductive anatomy. It just has to give them a better chance at being able to reproduce. And it's always about their environment. So, the fact that a grizzly bear is brown, would that be useful if they lived at the North Pole? Not really, because everything's white there. That's why polar bears maybe are white. So a couple of examples that I put for things that were good adaptations. One of them we already had from the grizzly bear was thick fur in polar bears. The other one is excellent night vision in owls because they hunt at night. And the thing that I want you to recognize is that everything is situational. Something that might seem like an adaptation for one organism living in one place would mean nothing to another organism. So when we say the word situational, it means it depends on the environment and on the interactions that exist in the environment. So I'll give you an example. Let's see, who has actual blonde? Megan, your hair's blonde, hey? Like it's actually blonde for real, not like mine. Yeah. So Megan has for real blonde hair. I don't think anyone else in the class has for real blonde hair. Mackenzie, your hair's darker to start off with, hey? Yeah. So I'm picking this out because today is the fact that Megan has blonde hair making her better at surviving. I don't think so. Probably not. Maybe it is, but generally, no. So generally, your hair color is not giving you an advantage nor a disadvantage for survival. But let's say that zombies are real and Hitler reincarnates and he comes back, and now having blonde hair and blue eyes is an advantage again, because if you don't, then you're not part of this mysterious superior race that supposedly exists. So the rest of us, we would be done for, I guess. Some of you have blue eyes and sort of lighter brown hair. You might be okay. I don't know. I don't know how he judged how blonde your hair had to be or how blue your eyes had to be. I know. This is what I'm saying. Yeah. His entire theory has flaws. Like his ancestors were neither blonde-haired nor blue-eyed. Neither was he. So I don't know. I don't know where his idea. I'm just using this as a rather ridiculous example to say that it's situational. It depends what's going on. So sometimes being able to fly would be an advantage, but for other organisms it would make no difference at all. So natural selection is situational. It depends on your environment and your interactions. Something is not inherently an adaptation. It's only an adaptation if it helps you survive in your environment. So that brings us to the word adaptive significance. That's how important the adaptation really is. So sometimes organisms have a characteristic and it will help them survive a bit, but maybe some of them will help them survive more. So, for example, we are humans. We have some adaptations, probably, if we think about the theory of evolution and where we might have come from. For example, we have opposable thumbs. That's an adaptation that we have. We also have the ability to walk on 2 feet. Maybe one of them is more important than the other, depending on your environment. So for example, if I am someone who builds machinery, probably the fact that I have opposable thumbs is more adaptively significant to me than being able to walk on 2 feet. I can sit in my chair, I can build my machines. But if I am an NFL player who needs to run on the field, and I'm not an offensive player, so I don't care about catching the ball, I just care about hitting the other guys, then it probably doesn't matter that I have opposable thumbs as much as it matters that I can walk on 2 feet. So adaptations don't all have the same significance. Some of them maybe are more important to survival than others. So together, number 2 and number 3 and number 5 and number 8 are all basically asking you about mutations. Number 2 asks what causes variation in species. And I think a few people might have gone like a step further and said, what are the factors that influence which variation is more advantageous? But we're actually getting at just what causes the difference in the first place. Variability in a species results from heritable mutations in DNA. So if you said something about DNA being changed, then that's one of the things that causes variability. The other thing that causes variability is sexual reproduction, but I have another slide about that. So we'll start just by talking about mutations. Now, like I said the other day, mutations don't have to be bad. In fact, sometimes you have a DNA mutation that gives you an advantageous characteristic. So question number 3 asks you to use examples from this chapter to show how mutations and natural selection happen by chance. So I have a couple of examples down here that illustrate mutations and natural selection. One of them is about a disadvantage, and one of them is about an advantage. And the one that's about an advantage is actually what question 8 was asking about pesticide resistance. So what is a mutation? A mutation is changes in the genetic information of a cell. Only mutations in a particular type of cell can be passed on. Does anyone know what the scientific name for a sperm and egg cell is? You know it in Spanish. What is it in Spanish? Oh, well, I could say a sperm or an egg cell too, but I mean there's one word that I could use to describe either of them. It starts with a G. Grayson, no? Oh, is this a word that you have not heard before? I feel like this should have been a grade 9 word, but if it's not, it's okay. Gametes are what we refer to as the reproductive cells. So a sperm cell or an egg cell, together they're in the group gametes. Gametes are cells that have half the number of chromosomes, so that when the two of them meet, they could form an individual with the correct number of chromosomes. But only mutations that affect those cells can be passed on. So it's important to recognize that not every mutation that happens to DNA is something that's heritable. Mutations can be caused by a bunch of things. Chemicals would be one, heat, radiation, and even some viruses can cause some DNA mutations. The key, though, is a mutation will only get passed on if it's affecting the reproductive cells. If you have a mutation to a skin cell, but that DNA is changed and the DNA in the sperm or egg cell are not, I can't pass that on. So mutations can only be part of the reason that variability exists, because not every mutation is heritable. So question number 5 gave the analogy of a newspaper editor talking about natural selection working with what is already there. So it talks about how a newspaper editor will fix things that already exist, but isn't going to make up a new news article. And so number 5 is really getting at the point that natural selection only works with the DNA that you already have. It's not going to give you new DNA. You wanting to reach food higher up in a tree will not magically transform your DNA. DNA can only be transformed by some of the processes that I've listed there. So natural selection is not going to change your DNA. The fact that your DNA is different might result in natural selection, but it doesn't go the other way. So don't ever say natural selection caused DNA to change. It always has to be changes in DNA lead to natural selection. So I have 2 examples that would be really good for you to know. One of them illustrates a selective disadvantage that a mutation brings about, and one of them illustrates a selective advantage. The selective disadvantage is something called sickle cell anemia. And I chose this one because it's well described in your book, but it's about hemoglobin, which is something that you know about. This is your normal red blood cell. It looks like a Campino candy if you were to look at its shape. In sickle cell anemia, your red blood cells have this weird half moon shape or quarter moon shape. In sickle cell anemia, the surface area of your red blood cells and thus its ability to contain hemoglobin and transport oxygen is incredibly reduced. So in sickle cell anemia, the person is exhausted and tired all of the time. So sickle cell anemia is caused by a mutation, and it is a disadvantage. You will be less healthy and less able to survive if you have sickle cell anemia. Now on the other side, mutations could definitely cause an advantage. This little graph here is just illustrating basically how many bugs are resistant to pesticides over time. And what we're seeing is that pesticide resistance has increased. Why has it increased? Well, we started using pesticides. This would have killed a large majority of whatever pest we're trying to kill. For examples, houseflies or mosquitoes and DDT. DDT used to be used in insect repellents to try to kill these pests. And a lot of them would have died. But some of them would have, by chance, had the correct DNA mutation that meant that DDT did not affect them. They didn't get it during their lifetime. They had it already. They were born that way. And so when the DDT started being used, they didn't die. Who reproduced? The resistant bugs survived to reproduce. So every successive generation, organisms that were not resistant to DDT would die. They wouldn't survive long enough to reproduce. But the ones who were resistant, they survived. They reproduced. So over several generations, and for bugs like mosquitoes, several generations could mean a couple of weeks. Over several generations, the composition of the population changed to where most of them were resistant. The same thing has happened with antibiotics. A lot of bacteria are resistant to the original type of antibiotic that we used to use to treat it because we've used it so much that the only versions of that bacteria that are left are the ones who were able to resist in the first place. So this is part of number 2. The other part of number 2, what causes variation, has to be about sexual reproduction. So sexual reproduction contributes to individual variations in populations and thus to the process of evolution. So if I ask you what causes variation, it's mutations to DNA and sexual reproduction. Both of those processes will cause the offspring to have different characteristics than the parents did. So I've just got a photo over here that has a couple of vocabulary words on it that go with reproduction. You'll see the word gamete. Gamete, like I said, is the category that both sperm and egg cells fall in. The word fertilization is when the sperm and the egg go together and mix their DNA, so that would be a source of variation. So those two words in particular you might run into in questions about how does sexual reproduction cause variation. When the gametes meet and fertilization happens, now I have two sets of DNA that are mixing together. I've also got a lovely photo over here of one of my friend's cats. You can very well see that the mother is white, but that some of the babies are black and some of the babies are white. This is illustrating that sexual reproduction, which is what cats use, will cause variation so that the offspring are not identical to the parent. Now the other question that goes with sexual reproduction is question number 7. And so I'm just going to read the question. It says, suppose that you were designing an investigation to measure variation within a population. Explain why it would not be appropriate to measure the length of 100 leaves from the same tree. So if we were to do an experiment like the one described in the book, and we wanted to measure variation in a population, we would need to recognize that we need to choose offspring from different parents. So that's just a point about how to set up a well-designed experiment. Yes, it's true that two parents could have offspring that are not all the same, but if you really want to get a good idea of variation in an entire population, you should pick offspring that come from multiple different sets of parents so that you have a better idea of what is going on. Now, does anyone have anything that they want to ask about either mutations or sexual reproduction? All right, so the scenario is the lady and her pumpkins. She's picking the best pumpkins. And 4A asks, is there selective pressure in this scenario? So this is kind of like a yes or no question. Yes, absolutely, there is selective pressure. What is selective pressure? If I had to give it a definition, selective pressure is a characteristic of the environment that I'll spell right, a characteristic of the environment that makes one organism more likely to reproduce. Now, in this scenario, the gardener is the selective pressure. She has decided which pumpkin is going to be used to provide the next generation of pumpkins. So the characteristic of your environment doesn't have to be some natural phenomenon. It could be another organism doing something or saying something or causing one organism to be unable to reproduce whereas another one is. Now, is this natural selection, which is what 4B asks? And the answer is, of course, no. Artificial selection is when there is some sort of decision or choice involved. And in general here, we say this is when people are in charge of deciding for another organism, do they get to reproduce or do they not? So anything that has to do with breeding, either of animals or of plants, would be an example of artificial selection. So Lots of you might have horses or cattle or something because you have some land. And when you decide which cow or which bull or which horse or whatever is going to be used to father the next generation, then you have done artificial selection. Natural selection is when a characteristic of the, we'll say, inanimate environment chooses. Now that's a little harder to describe. What I mean is it's not an organism or a person making a choice. It's something about, let's say, water flow. This organism is on one side of the river and this is on the other side of the river. They can't reproduce with each other. That's naturally selecting who is reproducing with who. So natural selection is where a characteristic of the environment chooses. And by chooses, we don't mean that the grass decides which animals get to eat it. We mean that depending on location or environment, an organism will either survive and reproduce or they will not.